The wind howled across the moors as if mourning something long gone. High atop the hill stood Wrenfield Manor, stone walls weathered by time and grief. Once alive with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses, the estate now echoed only silence. The windows, tall and arched, stared blankly outward like the tired eyes of a forgotten soul. Amelia Wren stood by the front door, gloved hands clutching the key that had once belonged to her mother. The metal was cold, biting against her palm as she hesitated. It had been 5 years since she last stepped foot on the soil. 5 years since the carriage pulled away with her inside, her parents waving from the steps, promising they'd write often. They didn't. And now they never would. The telegram had been brief. Your mother and father have perished in a fire. The estate is yours, and no condolences, no warmth. Just a brutal fact. She twisted the key in the lock, the door creaking open with a groan, like the house itself was reluctant to welcome her back. The scent of dust and old paper wrapped around her like a shroud. The grand chandelier in the foyer swayed slightly, the light from the tall stained glass windows muted. As if in mourning, she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing against marble. The portraits along the walls stared down at her, their painted eyes distant and disapproving. Her younger self, barely 15 in one of the paintings, smiled radiantly next to her parents. That girl was long gone. Amelia didn't cry. She hadn't cried when she received the news. She hadn't cried when she buried them in 2 cold coffins beneath the gray sky. And she didn't cry now, standing alone in the house that used to be her world, and no one had greeted her. The staff were long gone, dismissed during the family's decline. The few distant cousins who'd attended the funeral had left with eyes full of pity and excuses not to stay. Everyone had somewhere else to be. Everyone, except her. She ascended the staircase slowly, one hand trailing along the dust-covered banister. Room by room, she walked through memories. Her father's study, lined with worn books and unfinished letters. Her mother's piano, untouched, a single cracked key pressing down as she passed. Releasing a soft, broken note, she paused at her old bedroom door. It was still painted a soft shade of lilac. Inside, time had stood still, dolls on shelves, a framed journal on the desk, dried flowers in a vase beside the bed. Amelia sat on the bed, facing the window. Beyond the hills, the sun was sinking, casting long shadows through the trees. She pressed her fingers to the glass, fogging it with her breath, tracing the outline of the hills beyond. Alone, the word wrapped around her like a chain, heavy and cold, and somewhere deep inside her chest, something settled. Not grief, not fear, something worse. Emptiness. Welcome to Comic Love Story, the place where love meets laughter and romance comes with a side of chaos. From sweet misunderstandings to dramatic confessions, we bring you the funniest, most heartwarming love stories, because love is never just simple. Subscribe now and join the fun. Who knows? Your next laugh-out-loud love story might just be waiting for you. Comic Love Story, where love is a joke. Until it's not. Chapter 1. The wind did not whisper. It howled wild and unrelenting, like a creature clawing at the windows, begging to be let inside. But nothing entered Wrenfield Manor anymore. Not warmth, not laughter, not life. Amelia stood in the great hall, wrapped in a shawl that had once belonged to her mother. It smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. The scent made her stomach twist. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders, though it did nothing against the chill in the air. The silence here was unnatural. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else. An echo that had nowhere to land. Each step she took felt intrusive, as though the house were holding its breath, waiting for her to leave. Her footsteps bounced off the stone walls, swallowed quickly by the emptiness. She wandered into the drawing room. The curtains had been drawn, and motes of dust danced in thin blades of light. The furniture was covered in white sheets, draped like ghosts watching from every corner. She moved past them like she was walking through a mausoleum. On the fireplace mantel, a tarnished silver frame held a photo of her parents. They looked young, laughing, arms around each other, their eyes sparkling. She touched the frame and felt nothing. No warmth, no grief, just distance. She didn't belong here. Not really. The Amelia who'd lived here had once chased butterflies in the gardens. She had sat by the hearth, her father's booming laughter shaking the walls. She had danced across these floors in her stockinged feet, her mother scolding gently with a smile that never reached her eyes. But that Amelia was gone. And this house was just a shell. She walked to the kitchen, once bustling with cooks and staff. It was empty now. A single cracked teacup sat on the counter, as though waiting for someone who never returned. There was a creak above her. She froze, then silence again. The house was settling. Or remembering. That night, she ate nothing. Appetite was a stranger now. Instead, she lay on the old chaise lounge in the library, wrapped in a thin blanket. The firewood was too damp to light. Her breath fogged in the cold, and the quiet. She heard everything. The wind, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the beating of her own heart, slow and hollow. She closed her eyes, but sleep never came, only the sound of nothing and the weight of being the last one left. Chapter 2. The next morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a gray mist that clung to the windows like sorrow refusing to let go. Amelia sat at the edge of the long dining table, though only one end was ever used now. A place setting had been laid out by her own hand, porcelain china and silver cutlery, all for no one. The seat beside her stayed empty. They all did. She hadn't heard from her extended family since the funeral. No letters, no calls, no visits. Their silence echoed louder than any words could. When her parents were alive, they had hosted grand dinners, the kind where everyone smiled too widely and drank too much. The cousins would parade their latest successes, their voices swelling with pride, while Amelia sat quietly listening, observing, a shadow in a room full of lamps. Now, they had what they wanted, their own lives, their own ambitions. There was nothing left to gain from Amelia. No more connections. No more inheritance. Nothing to inherit except a crumbling house and a girl who didn't know how to ask anyone to stay. She walked through the manor's front garden, where roses once bloomed in chaotic beauty. Now, the bushes were tangled and overgrown, thorns reaching like fingers through the iron fence. The gardener had left long ago. Nature had taken back what had once been so meticulously groomed. A carriage passed by the gates. She turned, watching the occupants inside. 2 women and a child. They didn't notice her. Or if they did, they averted their eyes too quickly. Amelia wasn't sure what they saw, an heiress, a ghost, or something in between. Back inside, she wandered into her father's study. His favorite chair still faced the hearth. Papers littered the desk, some yellowed with age, others unfinished, their ink smudged and running. She pulled out a single letter. To whom it may concern, it was a business document, formal and cold. She flipped through more. Finance records, property taxes, correspondence about debts. One sealed envelope caught her attention. It was addressed to her, in her father's hand. Her breath caught. She opened it with trembling fingers, but it wasn't what she hoped. Just a list of household duties and instructions for when they were gone. There was no affection. No "I love you." Just obligations. Even in death, she was their duty, not their daughter. She folded the paper and tucked it into her dress pocket, the disappointment folding itself deep into her chest. That evening, she sat in the drawing room once more, her fingers brushing over the keys of her mother's piano. She pressed one soft, hesitant. It rang out weak and warbled, just like her daughter, and no one was coming back. No one remembered her. No one had asked how she was managing, if she needed help. They had all moved on, shedding her like old skin. The world had forgotten Amelia Wren, and she was starting to forget herself. Chapter 3. The attic was the only room Amelia hadn't entered. It loomed above the house like a sealed memory, its narrow stairs creaking with each reluctant step. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to coat her lashes. Cobwebs threaded across old trunks, broken furniture, and boxes labeled in fading ink. She lit the lantern and crouched beside the nearest crate, lifting the lid slowly. Inside were rows of old photographs. Her grandparents, great-uncles, women in gowns with stiff smiles and eyes like hers, blank and still. Some photos were labeled, others not. Names lost, people erased by time. She found her baby dress, folded with surprising care. A small knitted lamb rested beside it, its fur patchy and discolored. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. She remembered hugging it once after a thunderstorm, whispering to it when the dark got too loud. She set it down gently, as if it might still remember. In the far corner, under a moth-eaten tapestry, was a small trunk with a broken clasp. She forced it open and found her mother's journals. The leather covers cracked like dry skin. She opened the first one. It's hard to love when you don't know how to be soft. She blinked. Her mother had always been composed. Distant, elegant, untouchable. Amelia flipped through the entries. Page after page of aching honesty. Fears about motherhood. Loneliness within marriage. Regret. Shame. Not a single mention of Amelia's name until the final pages. I don't know how to reach her. I want to. But she stares at me with eyes that look too much like my own, and I see all my failures reflected back. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. But they didn't fall. She wasn't angry. Just tired. She had spent years wondering what she'd done wrong. Why her mother didn't hold her more. Why her father kept her at arm's length. And now, it was clear. It wasn't her. It had never been her. She wasn't unloved because she was broken. She was unloved because they didn't know how to love at all. She pressed the journal to her chest and sat in the attic, surrounded by the ruins of a family legacy that had been all title, no warmth. Wrenfield Manor had always been just a performance. Wealth, prestige. But no one had stayed. Not even the ghosts. The sun dipped below the horizon again, casting the attic in shadow. Still, she didn't move, because where would she go? There was no one waiting for her, and nothing left to chase, only echoes, and the sound of her own breathing in a house that never learned how to hold anyone close. Chapter 4. Amelia had begun to memorize the creaks in the floorboards. She could walk blindfolded and know exactly where the stair groaned, where the third tile in the corridor dipped, where the wind slipped through the broken pane behind the library shelf. The manor no longer surprised her. It had become a living, breathing thing, not with warmth, but with memory. The hallway on the east wing had always been closed when she was young. Storage, her father had said. No need to bother. But now the doors stood slightly ajar, hinges rusted and inviting. She stepped through them. It was colder here. The light barely reached past the threshold. The walls were lined with portraits she'd never seen before, men and women with hollow eyes and stiff mouths, as though the artist had captured the moment before they turned away. Their names were carved into brass plates, but the dust made it hard to read. She didn't wipe them. She didn't want to know. One door stood at the very end. She pushed it open and found a child's room. Not hers. This one was blue and gray, with toy soldiers frozen in formation on the windowsill. The bed was small and used, the sheets crisp with time. There was a single pair of shoes beneath the bed, scuffed at the toes. She didn't know whose room this had been. The servants who might have remembered were long gone. She backed away quietly, as though waking something. Back in the hallway, she ran her fingers along the wall. The wallpaper peeled where damp had gotten in. Beneath the curl of one edge, she noticed something etched into the plaster. A name. Then another. Then another. Dozens of names scratched into the wall, childlike and uneven. Some crossed out. Some repeated. Are you watching? Father? One line read, tucked into the corner. Another read simply, still here. She stared at the wall until her throat tightened. The manor was not just a home. It was a container. A vault of lost thoughts and children no one remembered. People who had passed through, silently screaming behind the velvet drapes and polished mirrors, and no one heard them then. And no one hears them now. She returned to her room and closed the door behind her. Outside, the wind howled again. But inside, something whispered, not from the attic, not from the walls, from her own chest, still here. Chapter 5. The days bled into each other, indistinguishable. The manor had no clocks. No need for them. Time was irrelevant when nothing changed. Amelia had ceased counting. She no longer bothered with letters or the occasional visit to the village. What was the point? No one expected her. The townsfolk only spoke of her in hushed tones, if at all. They had moved on. It was as if her disappearance into the manor had been some tragic, quiet ending and nothing more. But every evening, when the sun dipped low, she still sat by the front door. She couldn't help it. She waited. For someone. Anyone. Her fingers curled around the old brass knob, the one her mother had polished endlessly until it shone like gold. Every time the doorbell rang, or at least when the wind pushed it with such force that it sounded like a bell, Amelia's heart fluttered, only to sink when no one appeared. That night, the wind had carried something else, a soft, unsteady knocking at the door. Her pulse quickened. She stood up, almost afraid to move, as though the air would shatter if she made a sound. Slowly, she approached the door. The light from the lantern in the hallway cast long, jittery shadows along the floor. She hesitated. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. She opened the door, and no one was there, just the empty space before her. The gust of wind that carried the salt and earth smell of the sea, which had never been close enough for her to feel. The driveway was barren. The garden still overgrown, twisting wildly against the cold air. No figure stood there. No one had come to visit, but she didn't close the door. She stood on the threshold, letting the wind whip through her hair, feeling the chill on her face like a slap, as if it might wake her from some lingering dream. Still here, the words echoed in her mind, just as they had in the hallway. Had they been her own? Had she been talking to herself? She stepped outside, barefoot on the stone steps, her feet numb against the chill. The sky was dark and swollen with clouds, the stars blotted out by the heavy weight of the night. No one ever came, and no one was ever going to, and yet she stood there waiting, as though if she lingered long enough, someone would appear. Someone would remember that she was here, standing in the doorway, waiting for the life she had lost to come back. But the door stayed open and the wind howled and no one answered. Amelia stepped back inside. The silence pressed down on her like a weight, filling the empty spaces with a hollow sound that didn't belong anywhere else but within her own chest. Chapter 6. The days stretched longer, their edges fraying like tattered curtains. Amelia had stopped looking out the windows altogether. What was the point? The view was always the same hills, the same clouds, the same tree that stood at the edge of the garden. Nothing ever moved except the wind, and the wind didn't care about her. There was no escaping the stillness now. It had become too much a part of her, settling in her bones, occupying every empty corner of her mind. Even her thoughts had grown quieter, like the slow fading of a once thriving fire. The manor had always been cold, but now the cold felt like a presence. It reached into the rooms, into the spaces where memories lingered and pulled everything away. Even the pictures on the walls felt distant, as though the people in them had long forgotten her existence. She wandered through the rooms once more, her feet following the familiar paths, like a clockwork machine that had forgotten its purpose. Her reflection in the mirrors no longer startled her. She simply moved past them, unblinking. But today, as she passed the old mirror in the hallway, something caught her eye. A figure, not hers. It was fleeting, just a shadow that seemed to stretch too far, an outline that shouldn't have been there. She stopped and turned. The hallway was empty. The air felt heavy, thicker than usual, as though it were pressing down on her, holding her still. She blinked, and the shadow was gone. Was it a trick of the light? She wondered. But the question lingered too long, and doubt crept in. Had she imagined it? She stood there for a while, staring at the empty hallway. The silence was deafening. Her heart beat too loudly. The house had always been filled with sounds, footsteps on the stairs, the clink of plates in the dining room, the hum of conversation at dinner. It had never been this hollow. Her breath echoed in the quiet, sharp and insistent. She could feel the walls closing in, as though they were pushing her closer and closer together until there would be no air left to breathe. Still here, the words whispered through her mind again. She couldn't remember when the last visitor had come through the door. It had been years ago. A distant cousin, maybe. An old friend of her parents. She couldn't be sure. She couldn't even remember their faces. They'd walked in, smiled, exchanged polite words, and then disappeared again, as though the manor was just a place they had to check off their list before moving on. She was the last to remain, and she couldn't help but feel that even the house was beginning to forget her. The rooms seemed to stretch further now, their edges fading into shadows that didn't belong. The furniture, once pristine and carefully placed, now felt foreign. The objects, the paintings, the glassware, they all had the air of things someone had left behind. Things abandoned. She felt it then. The space between them, between her and the life she once had. Between her and the family who had once been hers. Between herself and everything she had ever known. The space was so wide, so vast that she couldn't see the other side anymore, and that was when she understood. And no one was coming. Not for her. Not for the manor. Not for the life that had been. She was alone. Completely and utterly alone, and the space between them, the ones who had left, the ones who had gone on, had swallowed her whole. Chapter 7. It had been days since she had stepped outside. She couldn't bring herself to do it. The silence outside felt just as heavy as the silence inside. It had begun to suffocate her, pressing against her chest like an unrelenting force. There was no more air to breathe in this house, no more room for her thoughts to escape. But today, something was different. A lettered IT lay on the floor just inside the parlor door, its crisp paper unmistakable. It was addressed to her, written in the same handwriting as the letters from before. Her father's handwriting. She froze. For a moment, she thought it might be an illusion, the mind playing tricks on her. It had been so long since she had seen anything like this, anything that wasn't faded or forgotten. With trembling fingers, she bent down and picked it up. The wax seal on the back had cracked, but it still clung together in its stubborn remnants. She didn't even think twice before breaking it open. The words spilled out, and her breath caught in her throat. Amelia, the letter began, but there was no warmth in it. No care. It was a formality, like everything else her father had ever done. Businesslike. Cold. If you are reading this, then you must know that I am no longer among the living. I have left you everything, my wealth, my property, but not my affection. You will never receive that. I never believed you deserved it. You were always a disappointment, Amelia. Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to keep reading. She had to know. She needed to know if there was anything else left. I hope the house serves you well, but I cannot promise you happiness. I can only promise that this letter will be the last you hear from me. As for the rest of the family, you are not one of them anymore. Do with this life what you will, but do not expect anything from us. We are done with you. The words blurred in front of her eyes. The room felt smaller, as if it were closing in. She hadn't expected love. She hadn't expected anything different, but the brutal finality of the words still shattered something inside of her. She had spent years hoping for some kind of recognition, some kind of understanding that never came. The letter fell from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. There it was. The truth, her father's final declaration of her place in the world, unchosen, unwanted, alone. Amelia sat there in the parlor for what felt like hours, staring at the letter, at the words that had been written with such cold certainty. She hadn't been prepared for the clarity, the sharp sting of the truth, and yet the silence in the room did not change. It stretched on, still and endless, until it was all that remained. Chapter 8. The letter lay on the floor, a cruel reminder of everything she could never change. The paper, still warm from her touch, seemed to weigh heavier now, as if the words had sunk deep into the fabric of the manor itself. The silence thickened, swallowing every ounce of her resolve. Amelia picked it up again, her hands shaking not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something that had lodged itself in her chest. The sting of her father's words didn't fade. She didn't even bother to fold the letter. She let it hang limply in her grasp, her knuckles white as she gripped it. There was nothing left to do but sit in the same empty room and let the weight of it all settle over her. For a long time, she sat still, barely moving, her eyes fixed on the letter. The manor had grown darker, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching further. The walls seemed to lean closer, like they were closing in on her. The house had always been suffocating, but now it felt like a tomb. She had not left this room since the letter arrived. There had been no need. The world beyond the manor had ceased to matter, but the memories, those damn memories, kept creeping back. She stood up suddenly, as though something inside of her was stirring, something that refused to be buried, something that couldn't remain silent. Her feet carried her to the hallway, to the stairs that led to the rooms she had long abandoned. The familiar places that once held her mother's voice, her father's presence, her brother's laughter, none of them had mattered in the end. They had all vanished, like the fading echoes of a song long forgotten. As she climbed the stairs, her hand grazed the walls, the wallpaper peeling under her fingers. Her mind wandered back to the days before it all crumbled. The days before she learned the truth about her family. She could remember the warmth in the house. Once, there had been warmth. There had been birthdays and dinners, laughter around the table, moments when she had believed things were okay, but they hadn't been. They never had been. She reached the top of the stairs and stood in front of her mother's old study. The door was ajar, as though it had been left that way on purpose, waiting for her. She pushed it open slowly. The room was just as she remembered. The desk sat in the corner, the chair still positioned in the way her mother had always kept it, angled just so. The bookshelves lined the walls, filled with novels she had never understood and papers covered in her mother's neat handwriting. The scent of ink and leather filled the air, but there was something else now, a stale heaviness that clung to the room, as if the air itself had given up. Amelia walked in and stood there, feeling the weight of her mother's absence more sharply than ever. She hadn't been here in years, hadn't dared to face this room. It was here that she had learned, as a child, that there were things in life you could never outrun, things that chased you down no matter how fast you ran. Her mother had always been a stranger to her, distant in a way that was impossible to understand until now. She walked to the desk and opened one of the drawers. Inside, there were more papers, old notes, letters, some of which were unreadable, smeared with time. But one caught her eye, a letter, yellowed and frayed, with the same handwriting as her father's, though a bit more hurried. I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I failed you, Amelia. I failed everyone. Her mother's words, written with desperation. Her heart twisted in her chest as she read the rest. You've never known the truth. But you will. When the time comes, you will. I can only hope you can forgive me. Amelia closed the letter, tears welling in her eyes, though she couldn't remember the last time she had cried. There was nothing left to forgive. Her mother had failed her, yes, but she had failed herself long before Amelia had come to understand it. The silence in the room was suffocating, but Amelia didn't leave. She couldn't. The past had seeped into the walls, into the very fabric of this house, and now there was no escaping it, still here. The words hung in the air, familiar and haunting, echoing off the walls, but there was no one left to hear them, no one left to listen. Chapter 9, the letter had been tucked away, but its weight lingered, pressing on her chest with each breath she took. Amelia had expected the pain, but she hadn't expected the hollow emptiness that followed. It was as if the words had drained everything from her, the last remnants of hope, the final shreds of her past. She couldn't escape it. The house felt more like a prison than ever, the walls pressing in, suffocating her with memories that refused to let go. She hadn't left the room since she found the letter. The rest of the manor was as empty as it always had been. but now it felt even more abandoned. The rooms whispered of loss, of things that had once been, and of the promises that had never been kept. Amelia stood by the window, staring out into the garden, but she didn't see the flowers or the overgrown paths anymore. All she saw was the reflection of her own face in the glass, pale and drawn, her eyes empty of the life they had once held. Her family had been her chains. They had bound her to this place, this house, with promises and expectations that had never been meant to be kept. They had shaped her, molded her into something she wasn't, and now that they were gone, the chains remained. Invisible but unbreakable, she wondered if they had known. Had they known what they had done to her? To themselves? Had they realized, before it was too late, that they had created this prison? Or had they truly believed they could simply walk away, leaving her to die alone in this desolate place? She couldn't tell. All she knew was that she was still here, still waiting, still bound by the chains of a past that refused to release its grip. Her mind drifted back to her mother's final words, the ones she had read in the letter. "I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend." The letter had been written in haste, the ink smudged as though her mother had been too frantic to care. The guilt had been there, unmistakable, but so had the distance. Her mother had been incapable of truly seeing her, of truly loving her. Amelia had spent so many years longing for that love, for that connection. But now, in the silence of the manor, she realized it was never going to come. It had never come. The truth of it hit her with a sharpness she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just alone. She was alone because they had made her so, because they had tied her to this place with their lies, their neglect, and their cruelty. The chains were not just physical. They were psychological, emotional, and no matter how hard she tried to walk away, they would always be there, dragging her back to the past, to the house, to the hopelessness that clung to her like a second skin. Amelia moved away from the window, her fingers brushing the cool glass. The house felt colder now, its emptiness more suffocating. She wandered aimlessly through the hallways, her footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The manor, once filled with life and warmth, now felt like a tomb. Each room seemed to swallow her whole, each corner hiding more of the past she couldn't escape. She opened the door to her father's study, the same door she had avoided for so long. The room was dark, the heavy curtains blocking out the faint light of the overcast sky. The air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and old leather. She stepped inside, feeling the weight of the room settle on her shoulders. Her father's desk loomed in front of her, the papers stacked in disarray, just as they had been the last time she had dared to enter. The room felt like a place of punishment, a place where decisions had been made, decisions that had shaped her life, that had led her here, to this place of unbearable solitude. The chair behind the desk was empty. It had always been empty, even when her father had been alive. His absence was like a shadow, stretching across the room, darkening everything it touched. Amelia stood in front of the desk, her fingers brushing the worn surface, feeling the years of neglect that had settled into every crevice. Her thoughts turned again to the letter, to her father's final words. "You will never receive my affection. You will never receive my love." She had read it over and over, but it hadn't made a difference. The words were just words, empty and final, like everything else her father had ever given her. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, lost in the weight of her thoughts. The silence pressed down on her like an invisible hand, suffocating her in its grip. It was unbearable. It always had been, and yet she could never leave. She could never escape the chains of the past, the chains that had been forged long before she was ever born. She was trapped. Trapped in this house, trapped in this life, trapped in the memory of a family that had never truly cared for her. Chapter 10. The days blurred together. Time had become irrelevant. Each moment was a mirror of the one before it, silent, unchanging, and suffocating. Amelia no longer looked at the clock. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of each passing second, heavy like the dust that settled on the furniture, like the mildew that had begun to creep up the walls. Everything in the house had aged, rotted and faded, but not her loneliness. That remained as sharp and cold as ever. She stood at the window once more, staring out into the overgrown garden. The once immaculate paths were now choked with weeds, the flowers long dead or trampled beneath the feet of time. The garden had been a place of life once. It had been her mother's pride, her constant, never-ending effort to make the world outside a little more beautiful. But now, even the flowers had withered, and all that was left was the shadow of what had once been. The house, too, was decaying. The cracks in the walls were no longer just cracks. They were the very veins of the building, carrying with them the history of neglect, of failure. She could feel the house groaning beneath her, the weight of its own history pressing down on her shoulders. Every room held a memory, some better than others, but all of them fractured now, broken pieces of a life that had once been whole. Amelia had always thought she could outrun it. The past, the mistakes, the failures. But now she knew. The past wasn't something you could outrun. It wasn't something you could bury deep enough to escape. It followed you, every step you took, every breath you drew. She looked at the portrait of her family hanging on the wall, an old, faded painting that had once been a source of pride. They were all smiling, standing close together, as though they were a unit. A family, a picture of happiness. But it had been a lie, one of many. There had never been happiness here, only masks, only performance. And now, even the smiles in the painting seemed false. She turned away from the window and walked slowly through the house. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very floors were resisting her movement. The rooms were empty, and yet they were full of ghosts, full of memories. But none of them were her own. Not anymore. She stopped in front of a door. The one she hadn't opened in years. The one that led to the attic. She had always avoided it, even when she was a child. It was a place of secrets, of forgotten things. It was a place her father had kept locked for years, but after his death, it had remained open, abandoned like everything else in the house. But today was different. Today, something pulled her to it. Something whispered that she had to face whatever lay behind that door. She couldn't avoid it any longer. The past would not be silenced. The stairs creaked as she ascended, each step a reminder of how much time had passed, how much had been lost. The air in the attic was thick with dust, the remnants of a life left behind. Old trunks sat in corners, filled with things she didn't recognize, things that no longer held any meaning. There were books, letters, photographs, all relics of a time she couldn't reclaim. Amelia's gaze fell on a particular trunk, one that stood apart from the others. It was the largest, the most worn, the one that had been placed in the corner when she was young. Her father's trunk, her heart beat faster as she approached it, her hand trembling as she reached for the lock. It was still intact, as if it had never been opened. She fumbled with the key, her fingers stiff from the years of disuse, but eventually, she managed to unlock it. The trunk creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside, there were letters. Dozens of them, all carefully stacked, all tied with ribbons, just like the ones she had seen in her father's study. Letters she had never read, letters she had never been allowed to see. But they were here, in front of her, waiting for her to finally face them. Amelia pulled out the first letter, its parchment yellowed with age, its ink faded but still legible. She opened it slowly, the familiar handwriting unmistakable. Amelia, the letter began, just as the others had. I have been thinking of you. You are the only one who still matters to me. But I can't change what has happened. I can't undo the past, but I can tell you this. There is more to this house than you know. More to your family than you ever realized. And I fear that if you uncover it, you will never be the same. The letter went on, but Amelia stopped reading. Her hands shook violently now, and her vision blurred with unshed tears. She had known, deep down, that there were things she didn't know, things her family had kept from her. But she hadn't realized how much had been hidden, how much they had buried. And now, standing in this attic, in the midst of forgotten things, she realized that she would never be able to escape it. Her family's secrets would always be with her, and they would haunt her until the end of her days. Chapter 11. The house felt like it was closing in on her, its walls pressing tighter with each passing minute. The attic was no sanctuary, only another place for her to confront the unrelenting truth that she had spent her life running from. Each letter she had read from her father twisted deeper into her soul, wrapping around her heart like a cold, unyielding chain. His words echoed in her ears, refusing to let her forget that there was more to her family's story than she had ever been allowed to know. She couldn't breathe. The air in the attic felt stale and suffocating, the dust that had gathered in the corners like the memories that had accumulated in her mind, forgotten, abandoned, and yet never truly gone. They lingered, waiting for her to uncover them, waiting for her to face the truth. Amelia closed the trunk with a quiet snap, her hands trembling as she sat back against the wall. The letters were now scattered at her feet, their contents burning into her mind, but they hadn't told her everything. They hadn't given her the answers she needed. What had her father meant? What was hidden in this house? And more importantly, what had her mother known? She looked around the attic, her eyes darting from one dust-covered object to another. There were no answers here, no comforting resolution. Just the past, lingering like a ghost, unwilling to move on. Amelia's chest tightened with the weight of everything she had learned. The family she had once believed in, the ones she had loved and trusted, had never been what they appeared. Her father's distant affection, her mother's cold silence, it had all been part of a larger, darker game. And she had been the pawn. She stood up, pacing in the cramped space, her breath shallow as panic began to set in. There was no escaping it. No escaping the truth, no escaping the chains her family had forged around her. She had tried for so long to run, to outrun the pain, to escape the house, to escape her past, but it was clear now. There was no escape. Her heart ached, and for the first time in years, she let herself cry. Not the quiet, controlled sobs she had grown used to over the years. This time, the tears were raw, each one a release of everything she had buried, everything she had tried to forget. Her mother's neglect, her father's coldness, her brother's disappearance. It was all too much. She collapsed onto the floor, her face buried in her hands, sobs racking her body as the years of repression poured out of her. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to feel anything. So long since she had allowed herself to acknowledge how much the past had shaped her, how much it had destroyed her. The silence in the attic was deafening, the only sound her own breathing, ragged and uneven. She wanted it to stop. She wanted it all to stop. But she couldn't. She was too deep in it now, and just as the weight of her grief seemed unbearable, she heard it. A noise. Faint at first, like a whisper from the past. But it grew louder, clearer, and Amelia froze. Footsteps. Someone was walking in the hall below her, the sound of their shoes echoing through the empty house. She strained her ears, certain she was imagining it, but the steps continued, moving closer, as though someone were heading straight toward the attic. Amelia stood up, her pulse racing as she tried to steady herself. Who could it be? There was no one left in the house. No one but her. The servants had long since left, and the last of her family had abandoned the manor years ago. The footsteps stopped just outside the attic door. A soft knock echoed through the room. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to run, to hide from whatever this was. But her feet were rooted to the floor, her legs shaking beneath her. The door creaked open slowly. Amelia didn't move. She couldn't. And when the figure stepped into the room, her heart skipped a beat. It was a woman. Tall, pale, with long, dark hair that fell in waves down her back. Her face was familiar, too familiar. Amelia's eyes widened in disbelief. Her mother. But how? Amelia's breath caught in her throat as the woman smiled. A strange, unsettling smile that held no warmth. It was a smile of recognition, of something deeper, something that Amelia couldn't quite understand. "You're here," the woman said softly, her voice echoing in the small, cramped attic. "I've been waiting for you." Amelia took a step back, her mind reeling, her body frozen in place. "What are you? How are you here?" she whispered, her voice shaky. The woman tilted her head slightly, the smile never faltering. "You always thought you were alone, didn't you? But you were never truly alone. I've been here with you all along." Amelia shook her head, disbelieving. This couldn't be real. Her mother was dead. She had died years ago, and yet, here she was, standing in front of her as though she had never left. The woman stepped closer, and Amelia felt a chill creep down her spine. "It's not too late," her mother said, her voice softer now, but still laced with an eerie undertone. "You can still change it all. You can still escape." Amelia's heart raced, her chest tightening as the world around her seemed to warp and bend. The walls of the attic seemed to close in, the shadows stretching like hands reaching for her. She stumbled backward, her legs too weak to support her, until she fell to the ground. The room was spinning now, the air thick and suffocating. And the only thing she could hear was her mother's voice. "You will never escape," the woman whispered, her eyes gleaming with something cold and unnatural. "Not until you understand." And then, the room went black. Chapter 12. Amelia's eyes flickered open. The world around her was still dark, the shadows of the attic stretching like a living, breathing thing. Her head throbbed, her body heavy and unresponsive. She blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but everything felt unreal, like she was trapped in a nightmare with no way to wake up. Her mother's face, that chilling smile, was it real? Was she here? Was she alive? The thought hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Amelia couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her mind spun in chaotic circles, each one a jagged shard of memory and emotion, tearing through her like a storm. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the dusty floor, searching for something solid, something to hold onto. She pushed herself up, her legs weak and unsteady beneath her. Her eyes darted around the room, expecting the familiar figure to reappear. But the attic was empty now, still, silent, and eerily cold. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, trapped in the cold emptiness of the room. Time had become irrelevant. It was just her, alone with the weight of the secrets she had uncovered. The truth had shattered her. Her mother had been gone for years, and yet she had felt her presence so vividly, so hauntingly, just moments ago. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. Her eyes fell on the letters scattered around her, those cursed words from her father, the secrets he had hidden from her, the dark truths about their family. The weight of them pressed on her chest, threatening to crush her. Amelia stood, her body moving instinctively, and she walked over to the trunk. Her fingers hovered over the remaining letters, the ones she hadn't dared to read yet. What was the point? She already knew that the truth would be unbearable, that there was nothing left but more lies. More broken pieces of a life she could never reclaim. But still, she couldn't stop herself. She picked up another letter, her hands shaking violently as she untied the ribbon. The parchment felt cool against her fingertips, and as she opened it, she braced herself for the revelation it would bring. The words on the page blurred, fading in and out as her vision swam, but she could still make out the faint strokes of ink. "I know you won't understand, but I've done what I had to do. The house is a prison, and you're my only hope for freedom. Everything I've done for you, to keep you safe." Her throat constricted, and she read the next part aloud, as if saying the words would make them less painful, less true. "The truth will destroy you, Amelia. But you have to know, the family you thought you had, your father, your mother, they weren't who you thought they were. They never loved you. They used you." Her vision blurred again, and she gasped for air, her hands clutching the letter like a lifeline. The words burned into her mind, scalding her thoughts, and she crumpled to the floor in agony. Her family had never loved her. She had never been anything more than a tool, a means to an end. They had kept her in the dark, using her to cover their tracks, to play their games. Her entire life had been a lie, and now she was left with nothing. The tears came then, pouring out of her as the weight of everything crushed her. The years of pain, the years of pretending to be something she wasn't, the years of trying to belong when she had never truly been part of this world. It all came crashing down at once, and she was powerless to stop it. The house, her family, the past, it was all a prison. A place where she had never truly been free, a place where she had never truly been loved. She had spent so long running from the truth, so long hiding from the ghosts of her past. But now, there was nowhere left to run. The truth had come for her, and it was too late to escape. Amelia collapsed onto the floor, clutching the letter to her chest. She had no more tears left to cry, no more strength to fight. She had nothing. Her mind was a shattered reflection, a fractured image of everything she had once been. She had lost herself, lost her family, lost everything she had ever known. And there was no way to put it all back together again. She had wanted answers, but the truth had only torn her apart. The attic was silent again, the only sound the soft rustle of the letter in her hand. Amelia closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise in her mind. But it wouldn't stop. The echoes of her past, the whispers of her family's betrayal, the cold touch of her mother's face, it was all too much, and in that moment, Amelia knew. She would never escape it. She would never be free. Chapter 13, the silence in the attic was deafening, suffocating, as if the very air had become too heavy for her to breathe. Amelia sat there, hunched over, clutching the crumpled letter in her hand as though it was her only tether to reality. But the reality was slipping away, slipping through her fingers like sand. She had asked for answers, had begged the world to reveal the truth to her, but now that the truth was in her hands, she wished she could unlearn it. The betrayal of her family, the lies that had shackled her to this place for so long, they were too much for her to bear. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but it was no use. The pieces of her life, the fragments of her memories, no longer fit together. It was as though everything she had believed in had been a carefully constructed illusion, a story written by hands that had long since turned to dust. The letters from her father, they weren't just confessions, they were curses. She had read them all, one by one, each one pulling her further into the darkness. He had known. He had always known. And still, he had left her to fend for herself, to fight the battles he had orchestrated, to face the consequences of their family's sins. A sharp breath tore from her chest as her vision blurred with tears again. She had thought she was strong, that she could endure whatever came her way, but she had never imagined this. This level of betrayal, this crushing weight of loneliness. The darkness in the attic seemed to press in on her from all sides. The shadows, once merely things of the corner of her vision, now felt alive. They watched her, waited for her to break, and she was breaking. A sound, soft at first, like a whisper cut through the stillness. A familiar sound. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable. Amelia's heart stopped, and no one had come to visit her. No one but the memories of her past, and no one could reach her now. But those footsteps, those belonged to someone she knew. Someone she had once trusted. With a trembling hand, she reached for the nearest object, a dusty old mirror leaning against the wall. She held it in front of her, trying to steady her shaking hands, her breath shallow and quick as she watched her reflection. The woman staring back at her seemed unfamiliar. Her face was pale, drained of life, as though the weight of everything that had happened had stripped away the person she once was. Her eyes, once bright and full of hope, were now hollow, darkened with despair. "Who am I?" she whispered to the mirror, her voice ragged and cracked. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Someone was near. Her heart began to pound in her chest. She had to get out of here. Had to run. The attic, the house, it was suffocating her, closing in on her from all sides. But her legs refused to move. She was paralyzed by the very thing she had spent her life avoiding: the truth. The truth that her family had never cared for her. that they had used her as a pawn in their game, and now they were here. Her mother, her father, all the ghosts of her past. Amelia dropped the mirror, the shards of glass scattering across the floor like 1,000 broken pieces of her life. She couldn't face herself anymore. Not now. Not after everything that had been revealed. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. A cold chill spread through the room as the door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was a figure she thought she would never see again, her brother. Daniel, he had disappeared years ago. She had never known what had happened to him, why he had left, why he had abandoned her when she needed him the most. And now, here he was, standing in front of her, his face pale, his eyes distant. "Amelia," he whispered her name, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "You don't know everything. You never did." Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" He stepped forward, his gaze flickering over her, studying her as if he were seeing her for the first time. "I'm sorry. I thought I could protect you. I thought if I left, you'd be safe. But I was wrong." Her mind reeled. She had so many questions, so many things she needed to understand. But his words made no sense. Protect me? From what? Daniel's expression twisted with guilt, as if he were wrestling with something far too heavy to bear. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. "From everything. From our parents. From the truth." Her head spun, her body trembling as the weight of his words sank in. "The truth," she whispered, almost afraid to ask. "What truth?" He didn't answer immediately, his silence as crushing as the room around her. And then, finally, he spoke again, his voice breaking. "Everything that's happened, everything that's been done to you, to our family, it wasn't just them. It was me, too. I was complicit. I didn't stop it. I couldn't." And now he trailed off, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." The world seemed to tilt around her. Amelia's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. The shattered pieces of her life, her family, her entire world, all of it came crashing down in that one devastating moment. She had never been alone. But now, she realized it was worse than being alone. She had been betrayed by everyone she had ever loved. Her brother, her parents, none of them had ever been what they seemed. Amelia's mind shattered completely, the jagged pieces scattering in all directions. And as the darkness closed in, she whispered the only words she could find. I can't do this anymore." Chapter 14. Amelia's body felt weightless, her thoughts swirling in a dizzying vortex. The room around her, once so familiar, now felt like a prison. It had always been a prison, hadn't it? A gilded cage she never saw for what it truly was. Her brother's words echoed in her mind, but they no longer held meaning. "I'm sorry." The apology was hollow, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman who no longer had the strength to reach for it. The quiet was unbearable. She could still hear her breath, ragged and shallow, and the pounding of her heart, each beat a reminder of the life she had lost, of the life she had never truly lived. Daniel's figure had faded into the darkness, leaving her alone once more. He had said his piece, as though that would be enough to erase the years of lies and betrayals. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Amelia stumbled to her feet, the cold wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. She wasn't sure if she was walking towards something or running from it. She just needed to move, to escape the suffocating air that pressed down on her chest. Her hands brushed against the walls as she navigated through the attic, but nothing felt real anymore. The house was empty now. She was empty. The person she once was had been swallowed by the darkness, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. The truth, once so elusive, had been revealed in fragments, shattered pieces that no longer fit together. Her family had never been a family. They had been monsters in disguise. Her mother, her father, her brother, they had all played their parts in her undoing, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that was never truly hers. Amelia stopped at the window and looked out, the world stretching out before her in all its cold, indifferent beauty. The sky was dark, the stars barely visible through the haze of clouds. There was no escape, no place where she could hide from the truth that had torn her apart. The past was gone. Her family was gone. Everything she had known, everything she had trusted, had been a lie. But as she stood there, staring into the void, something inside her broke. She wasn't sure if it was her heart or her spirit, but something finally snapped. She had spent so long clinging to the past, so long trying to make sense of a world that had never made sense. And now, there was nothing left but silence. Amelia closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all, the betrayal, the loneliness, the loss. She didn't fight it. She let the sorrow wash over her, letting the tears fall freely, uncaring of the path they carved down her face. This was the end. She had been running her entire life, running from the truth, running from her family, running from the pain. But now there was nowhere left to run. The finality of it all was suffocating, and yet there was a strange kind of peace in it. The world had turned its back on her, but in that moment, she realized that she had nothing left to fight for. She had nothing left to lose. She was alone. And for the first time in her life, she was truly free. The house behind her groaned, as though it, too, was ready to collapse under the weight of the truth. The walls were closing in, but Amelia didn't care. She stepped away from the window, her gaze unfocused, her mind numb. There was no turning back now. As the last vestiges of her strength drained away, Amelia sank to the floor, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. The darkness around her seemed to swallow her whole, and she let it consume her. It had always been this way, hadn't it? The loneliness, the isolation, the suffocating silence. But now there was no more pretending, no more lies, and in the stillness that followed, the final pieces of her shattered mind slipped into place. She was broken, but she was no longer afraid of the brokenness. She had nothing left to fear. The quiet stretched on, unbroken and infinite. It was the end of her story, and yet it felt like the beginning of something else. But she didn't need to know what came next. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had become free. Chapter 14. Amelia's body felt weightless, her thoughts swirling in a dizzying vortex. The room around her, once so familiar, now felt like a prison. It had always been a prison, hadn't it? A gilded cage she never saw for what it truly was. Her brother's words echoed in her mind, but they no longer held meaning. "I'm sorry." The apology was hollow, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman who no longer had the strength to reach for it. The quiet was unbearable. She could still hear her breath, ragged and shallow, and the pounding of her heart, each beat a reminder of the life she had lost, of the life she had never truly lived. Daniel's figure had faded into the darkness, leaving her alone once more. He had said his piece, as though that would be enough to erase the years of lies and betrayals. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. Amelia stumbled to her feet, the cold wooden floor creaking beneath her weight. She wasn't sure if she was walking towards something or running from it. She just needed to move, to escape the suffocating air that pressed down on her chest. Her hands brushed against the walls as she navigated through the attic, but nothing felt real anymore. The house was empty now. She was empty. The person she once was had been swallowed by the darkness, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. The truth, once so elusive, had been revealed in fragments, shattered pieces that no longer fit together. Her family had never been a family. They had been monsters in disguise. Her mother, her father, her brother, they had all played their parts in her undoing, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that was never truly hers. Amelia stopped at the window and looked out, the world stretching out before her in all its cold, indifferent beauty. The sky was dark, the stars barely visible through the haze of clouds. There was no escape, no place where she could hide from the truth that had torn her apart. The past was gone. Her family was gone. Everything she had known, everything she had trusted had been a lie, but as she stood there, staring into the void, something inside her broke. She wasn't sure if it was her heart or her spirit, but something finally snapped. She had spent so long clinging to the past, so long trying to make sense of a world that had never made sense. And now, there was nothing left but silence. Amelia closed her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all, the betrayal, the loneliness, the loss. She didn't fight it. She let the sorrow wash over her, letting the tears fall freely, uncaring of the path they carved down her face. This was the end. She had been running her entire life, running from the truth, running from her family, running from the pain. But now there was nowhere left to run. The finality of it all was suffocating, and yet there was a strange kind of peace in it. The world had turned its back on her, but in that moment, she realized that she had nothing left to fight for. She had nothing left to lose. She was alone. And for the first time in her life, she was truly free. The house behind her groaned, as though it, too, was ready to collapse under the weight of the truth. The walls were closing in, but Amelia didn't care. She stepped away from the window, her gaze unfocused, her mind numb. There was no turning back now. As the last vestiges of her strength drained away, Amelia sank to the floor, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. The darkness around her seemed to swallow her whole, and she let it consume her. It had always been this way, hadn't it? The loneliness, the isolation, the suffocating silence. But now there was no more pretending, no more lies, and in the stillness that followed, the final pieces of her shattered mind slipped into place. She was broken, but she was no longer afraid of the brokenness. She had nothing left to fear. The quiet stretched on, unbroken and infinite. It was the end of her story, and yet it felt like the beginning of something else. But she didn't need to know what came next. She had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had become free to epilogue. The house, once filled with the echoes of laughter and family, stood silent, abandoned to time. The attic, where Amelia had spent her final moments unraveling the truths that had bound her, was now empty, just like the rest of the house. Years had passed since that fateful night, but the memories lingered, haunting the walls. The letters, the confessions, the betrayal, they remained, untouched, as if waiting for someone to piece them together. But there was no one left to hear their stories. Amelia's name had been forgotten, lost to the winds of time. The world had moved on, as it always did, indifferent to the pain of a single soul, and in the stillness, in the empty house, there was only the quiet of a world that had long ago ceased to care. The end.